Atheist YouTuber Derek Lambert lied about the sleepers of the cave story in the Quran on his channel MythVision. Recently, Derek Lambert made the claim that the Quran stole the story of sleepers of the cave from a Christian legend.
Muhammad didn't reveal history, he recycled a legend.
However, this is a lie. If you want to know how he lied to his audience, then please watch this video until the very end. So, let's get started.
When I say the sleepers in the cave story in the Quran is lifted straight out of the Christian tale from centuries earlier, it sounds shocking. But once you know the Christian legend and then compare it to the Quran's version, the connection becomes undeniable. First, let's listen to Ashab al-Kahf, companions of the cave, from Quran chapter 18, verses 19 through 26. These young men lived in a city full of idol worship. They refused to bow down to many gods and insisted on worshiping the one true God. To escape persecution, they hid inside a cave, along with their faithful dog. God then caused them to fall into a miraculous sleep. The Quran says 300 years, plus a little more. So now let's immediately hear the closest parallel to the Quran. That is the Syriac Acts of the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus. Christians are being hunted down and forced to bow before pagan gods. A group of brave young men in Ephesus refuse. Instead, they sneak away into the mountains, crawl into a cave, and promptly fall asleep. They drift into a miraculous slumber that lasts not one night, not 1 year, but over 3 centuries. Now, if Muslim apologists try to flip it and say, no, the Christian version is false, but our Quranic version is the real history, that's actually even worse to me. Think about it. The Quran comes 150 years after the Christian versions were already viral across the Near East in Syriac, Greek, Coptic, and Latin.
Stop the cap!
This is a lie, because there is no concrete historical evidence that proves that this story actually pre-existed before the Quran. I know this may sound shocking because of how confidently he's speaking, but even in his own video, he gives a time period of 5th century.
The story of the seven sleepers took off in the mid-5th century, just after Theodore of Mopsuestia died.
This video is actually a re-upload because the last time I actually uploaded this video, I made some mistakes. MythVision, in the video, he claims that the story of the sleepers of the seven cave actually comes from mid-5th century. Now, originally, I actually thought he was talking about like literally 550 CE or something like that, right? Obviously, people don't count centuries like that, right? For example, let's say you want to say 5th century. What that actually means is that from the year 400 to 499. So that would be the 5th century, right? So when he says mid-5th century, he's basically referring to 450 to 549 CE, right? The timeline he's actually referring to is a bit earlier. So I kind of got that wrong.
Another issue is that he doesn't say what is the actual estimated carbon dating period of this manuscript he's referring to is. So I simply assumed it to be at least 100 years. It is impossible to state an exact date of these kind of manuscript, so I'll be charitable and assume he's not claiming the exact date of the manuscript when he says mid-5th century, because if he is, that'll be incredibly stupid and dishonest. I don't think he's that stupid.
But it doesn't affect my argument. If this is actually the case, that the earliest manuscript of the Sleepers of the Cave actually comes from 549 CE, that timeline actually correlates with when we can date the earliest manuscript of the Quran. The earliest manuscript we have is actually from 543 CE, which is the Sana manuscript. So you can no longer argue and say that one comes earlier and the other comes later, because they're both from the same timeline, from 549 CE, right? The second problem that he actually kind of falls into is that, let's say for the sake of argument that he's correct, that the Sleepers of the Cave story from the Christian legend actually has a manuscript that predates the Quran, right? That still doesn't help him. That's because one of the main problem of radiocarbon dating is that it doesn't actually tell us when the material was written. It only tells us the carbon date of the actual paper or the ink, right? But it doesn't tell us when the ink was used to write the paper, right? When the actual text was written. It doesn't tell us that. It simply tells us the age or the carbon date of the paper and the ink. So even if I were to give him this argument that Christian legend manuscripts come earlier, it still doesn't prove that it was actually written earlier than the Quran.
So why is it you're claiming that the Quran is the thing that copied from these other manuscripts, but not saying that the other manuscripts are actually the ones who copied from the Quran? Because it's very much possible that these Christian manuscripts were actually written after the Quran was complete. Is it not possible? Of course it's possible. As a matter of fact, this makes perfect sense because Muslims conquered Syria around 630, I think, 30 to 38. So it would make perfect sense that these Christian writers, when they're faced with this kind of like overwhelming Muslim force, they will adapt some of the Muslim stories to convince the Muslims of their own religion, do some polemics or rhetoric, or show how their religion is not too different from Muslims, right? So yeah, his argument completely falls apart because it's not even true that these stories actually come before the Quran was written. There is no historical evidence that proves that the story of the 7 sleepers of the cave come before the Quran was written. He's committing a logical fallacy known as the ambiguity fallacy. So the way ambiguity fallacy works is that you have a premise that is very ambiguous. So from that you go to a conclusion that doesn't logically follow because there's many ways to interpret that premise. Same thing here. This premise that
these manuscripts are estimated to come from a contemporary timeline to the Quran.
So it's ambiguous premise. You can interpret it to mean it comes before, but you can also interpret it to mean it actually comes later, right? And because of that, his conclusion doesn't logically follow from the premise. That's why it's a fallacy. This argument doesn't work. By the way, when I say that the earliest manuscript of the Quran, I'm talking about the Birmingham manuscripts. And the Birmingham manuscript actually does contain the sleepers of the cave story, right? So you can't even argue that, oh, this story didn't exist back then in the Quran. No, it did. We literally have it in the manuscript. So yeah, there's no evidence that this story predates the Quran. Now, the thing is that even if it did, let's assume that this story did exist. It still wouldn't prove anything because it's still a non-sequitur fallacy. Because just because something comes earlier doesn't mean it's more reliable. Now, the thing is that things get even worse for him if we assume that he's correct, right? Let's assume that he's correct, right? That this story did exist before the Prophet. So what? Like, what does it prove? Because you still have a lot of legwork to do, right? If this story did exist, you need to prove how it came from Syria to Mecca, right? You need to show a kind of like paper trail, historical paper trail. You need to show how it was common in the 6th century, historically, and that Prophet ﷺ came into contact with this story. And second, you need to prove how Prophet ﷺ knew this story and copied this story to the Quran. But you cannot do any of this because you have no evidence of any of this. So this is just a baseless assertion. There's no evidence that the Prophet ﷺ knew anything about this story prior to the Quran was revealed. There's simply no evidence of this, right? And because the thing is that everyone knew that he was illiterate, right? That he didn't know, he didn't read. He's not knowledgeable in Christianity. There's even a hadith where Prophet ﷺ asked people of the Torah about what the punishment is for adultery. Again, why would he be asking if he's this knowledgeable guy in Christian mythology and whatnot? So yeah, clearly there's no evidence that the Prophet had any idea about Christianity or knew anything about Christian mythology or heretical Christian position. Like they make it sound like Prophet ﷺ was like some kind of like Christian scholar or something. No, it's just baseless assertion. And the thing is that these Orientalist arguments are so bad, if you start analyzing it, you can rip it to shreds. I can find even more faults with this, but I don't have the time. So I'm going to end it here. If you guys like the video, don't forget to like, share, subscribe. If you want to support me, then please support me by becoming a patron or a YouTube member. Just because next time,